Good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and give you a flavour of what I think is a very important survey, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that to you. I need to give you a little bit of background, first of all, about the survey, so you know how we've collected these findings and figures, and then I'll talk to you about it in some key areas. First of all, we talked to about 1,100 people last year. It was representative of Northern Ireland. We stratified the survey to make sure that it was representative. It's also a sample survey, however, so you need to be mindful that if figures are sort of about 5 percentage points difference, they're probably the same or similar, we would say. So if they're about 5% different, you consider them the same. We did the survey in people's own homes. That generally leads to better response. And the survey was actually conducted in September of last year. It's comparative. It's the third time we've run the survey. But we also use questions from other surveys so that we can compare different times in Northern Ireland, but also across Europe. And we try and pick, if we're developing new questions, we try and see if there are any comparable questions elsewhere. And there'll be some examples of those as we go through today. So really, we ask questions in three key areas: attitudes, experiences, and awareness and support. And I'm going to talk to you about each of those. In terms of the attitudes, we asked about people's attitudes towards equality and diversity as sort of as a concept. We asked people's attitudes towards each other. And we asked people what their perceptions were of who was the most unfairly treated in Northern Ireland. We also asked people about their own experiences. We asked about their own experiences of unfair treatment, whether they thought in the last 3 years they'd experienced any. We added a new module of questions this time about experiences in the economic downturn. I'll speak very briefly about those later. And we also asked about people's awareness. Did you know about equality laws? Did you know about the protections that were available? Did you know about the Equality Commission and what were your views on the Commission itself? So we have these top level answers, and it's at that top level I'll focus today in the sort of next 25 minutes. But the survey also has a range of demographic information. In the same way that you have answered the Quizdom this morning about who you are, we asked a range of questions of those who were answering our survey. And that means that when you go to the full survey, you can break the details down by gender, by age, by long-term limiting illness, which is a proxy for disability, by black and minority ethnic group, just to go through some of the acronyms there. You can break it down by a range of groups, and therefore it allows for quite a detailed analysis. So we would hope maybe after today you'll turn to that to maybe look at some specific issues. So, on with the first section then, the attitudes, and this is where I'll spend most of the time in the talk. As I said, sort of three key areas we were looking at, but in terms of the attitudes, we also broke that down. Now, we broke it down into general attitudes, how positive or negative you would feel about different groups, but we also asked about attitudes in specific circumstances, and it's an interesting way to do it, and I'll come back to that later. So, first of all, equality and diversity. Strong support for equality and diversity. 91% felt there was a need for equality laws, and that's remained similar across all the surveys we've done, the same sort of figure in 2005 and 2008. 77% of people felt there was a need to further strengthen equality laws in Northern Ireland, and the Commission's doing an amount of work to encourage legislative reform in disability, age and race at the moment. We also asked what you thought was the most important equality issue. 42% felt religion, and also a similar percentage felt age. So those were the two areas that people thought were the most important equality issues at the moment. But some interesting contrast to that later as we go through the survey. How has importance of equality issues changed over time? Well, if you look at the left-hand two bar charts there, 80% of people feel that equality is either the same, around 50% of people, or another 30% of people feel it's got more important over the last 3 years. And that's actually increased slightly from when we asked that before. But certainly equality as important or increasing over time. There's also support for diversity. Around, when we asked, would you like to see more of, around 2/3 of people would like to see more female MLAs, more women in management positions, more disabled people in the workplace, and around half of people would like to see more MLAs of different ethnic origin. And those figures similar or slightly up again on when we asked that question 3 years ago. So support for equality, which is similar or increasing. Support for diversity, which is majority, similar, increasing. We asked, do you think enough is being done to fight discrimination? So around half are satisfied, but around a third are dissatisfied. They feel that more needs to be done to fight all forms of discrimination. So interesting as well in terms of the positive attitude there. But contrasting against that, we asked, do you ever think there's a good reason to be prejudiced against certain groups? And although over half disagree with that, a third of people feel that sometimes there is good reason to be prejudiced against certain groups. So this is the first time we've asked that question. It's certainly of interest to the Commission. We picked it up from the Scottish Attitude Survey, and the figure is similar to when that question's been asked in the Scottish Attitude Survey. It was also around a third of people in Scotland last year felt that it was okay to hold those prejudices. So something, certainly a marker for us. So if I then move into general attitudes and maybe then start to contrast some of the findings, if we ask you how positive or negative you feel towards certain groups, and certainly the majority of people are positive towards groups across the board, but there are negative attitudes, and the most substantial of those are presented there on the slide in front of you. Around a third of people, travellers, around a fifth of people have negative attitudes towards transgender and migrants, and about 1 in 7 towards LGB and BME groups. I can put that on a graph for you, so you can see the top categories there. You can also see some of the other categories that didn't rank in the top 5. 7% of people, feel negative attitudes towards someone of a different religion, dropping right down to 1 and 2% for men and women. If I compare that with when we asked those questions 3 years ago, by and large, you see the bars are quite closely together. The green bars are quite close to the blue being 2011. So what we're seeing that negative attitudes haven't changed that much. It's around the same. For LGB people, it looks like negative attitudes have fallen, which is encouraging. And again, we'll contrast that as we go through the survey. So I'm going to use this slide. I'm going to dock on this slide the top 5 groups in terms of general negative attitudes. And as I go through the presentation, every time I do a section, I'll add the top 5, and we can sort of see the views differ or views the same as we go through it. So that's the top 5 groups in terms of who you would actively say I feel positive or negative about. These are the negative groups. I told you we had the demographic information. Just to give you a little flavour of that demographic information, those more likely to hold negative views, so more likely to differ from the average of the group as all. Males are more likely to hold negative views generally. Those with a long-term limiting illness are more likely to. Those from Belfast, and those with no or post-primary qualifications. It does vary according to the group. People hold different views for travellers than they do for migrants, but broadly that's the sort of pattern that seems to be coming out in terms of those negative attitudes. So, if that's general attitudes, what about attitudes in specific situations? So what we actually asked was, would you mind someone of those groups as a work colleague? Would you mind them as a neighbour? And would you mind them if they were a close relative or an in-law? And the general idea behind that is that views can change, and when you put people in a specific circumstance or with social proximity, you can have different views from someone you just have to work with someone that you might have to interact with more often. So the top ranking category was travellers. So I told you before that around 30% of people said that they had negative attitudes to travellers. But actually when you say, would you mind working with them? It goes up to 35. And would you mind them as a neighbour, or would you mind them as an in-law? It goes up to over half of people. And we can do this sort of analysis for a range of the groups. So what I can do is, rather than work through them one at a time, is try and show you them on a graph. So at the work colleague here to your left, neighbour and in-law, so this is the work colleague figures on the left-hand side. The percentages up the far side. On this side, the key and it's in the same order as the line. So for example, the traveller line is the top blue one. So left-hand side, 35% of people would mind them as a work colleague, rising to 55% for a neighbour and an in-law. So what you can see is people most mind travellers, transgender. They sit out above the others. People next most mind LGB, migrant workers, and those with a mental ill health. Mental ill health sits above other types of disability, learning disability, physical disability, and also religion at the bottom, so a cluster of 3. You can see also that the gradient does go up, so people are more likely to mind in terms of closer social proximity. I can compare that with the question when we asked it 3 years ago. So closest to me is the same 2011 graph you had a minute ago. Furthest away is the data from 3 years. Couple of things to point out. First of all, the lines are all clustered in the same way that they were before. So 3 years ago, it was travellers. We didn't ask transgender 3 years ago. It's a new question for us. But LGB, migrant workers, mental ill health were again in that middle band. And learning disability, physical disability, and religion were at the lower end of where people would mind. The numbers have all gone up slightly, is another thing that you could see. So it's not totally true in all cases, but by and large, the figures have moved up. There appears to be a hardening of negative attitudes over the last 3 years, and that's different from the general question. The specific situation seem to be edging up. So that's another, I think, important finding. If I go back to my little bubble diagram, so I had previously told you these were the top 5 groups. I can now tell you that these are the top 5 groups in this category, and you can see that I've bolded 4 of them. 4 of them are the same, so there's actually a fair degree of consistency between who you would rank as saying you have negative attitudes towards and who you would mind in certain situations. So again, we'll dock that for a second and we'll come back to that again. I can again tell you who thought those things about in terms of the would you mind, and again there's some similarities to what I told you before. So again, males, those with a long-term limiting illness and those from Belfast are more likely to have stronger specific negative attitudes. Older and higher pay had also come through on this one where they didn't before. So if that's what you think about people, then who do you think society treats most unfairly? Is an interesting question to ask. So you can already tell it's in some way different. The highest grouping was people aged over 70. So if asked who do you think is treated most unfairly, the biggest category of answer is people aged over 70. LGB and disabled are there, mirroring some of the negative attitude stuff. 13% of people also think that Catholics are most treated most unfairly at present, and then behind that, Eastern European migrant workers. Again, I could put those figures on a graph for you so you can see the 5 to the left that I've just talked about, but you can also see some of the other figures. So again, men and women closest to me, they're not being seen as treated unfairly. I can compare that with 2008. So what you see in terms of the figures at the left-hand side, those thinking that people over 70 are treated the most unfairly is actually the same number as before. It was 15% in 2008 and it's 15% now. One of the biggest changes is for the 2 very tall green bars. For black and minority ethnic groups, 24% of people last time thought they were treated unfairly. They just don't think that anymore. That's a considerable change in a 3-year period. Similar concept with travellers. 16% last time has fallen to 8% this time. So it's not that more people think that people over 70 are more unfairly treated. It's that a lot fewer people, the top 2 ranking, BME and travellers, have fallen away down the rankings. Interestingly, in terms of the increases, the Catholic figure has actually gone up. Last time only 5% thought Catholics and 4% thought Protestants. This time 13% think Catholics and 8% think Protestants. So they've both seen a rise, but the Catholic figure certainly moving up the rankings there. So we can compare that. So again, you've got the strongest negative attitudes, and I can put those being seen as being treated most unfairly. So a fair degree of mismatch there. Only 2 of the categories from who you hold negative views or would mind, map on to who you actually think are being unfairly treated in society. So I think that's an interesting finding about how we assess unfair treatment, etc., etc. We then went on to ask people about their own experiences. So we're not asking you how you think others are treated, we're asking you how you think you have been treated. So we asked, did you think that you had been unfairly treated or harassed in the last 3 years? And 33% of people felt that they had been unfairly treated in the last 3 years. Now, the last time we asked that question, it was 16%. So that's doubled since we last asked that. We looked for a comparator for that figure. Last time around, it was 16% in Northern Ireland, but it was also 16% in Europe. This time it's 33% here. The UK and Europe haven't updated their figures since, so I don't have a comparison for you, so I don't know if we're better, worse, or the same than elsewhere, but certainly I know that people's assessment of harassment has changed, and it's changed for the worse. They're more likely to say that. Who's more likely to say it? Some of the demographic information again. So it's 1/3 of people in general feel they've experienced unfair treatment. It's 2/3 of black and minority ethnic people feel they've experienced unfair treatment. It's 1/2 of LGB. It's 40% of those in Belfast, and it's 40% of those with a limiting long-term illness. Those are the categories coming out on top there. So again, differences by group then can start to think about where you need to target policy responses or et cetera, et cetera. So I can put that on the slide again. So how does that mirror up? How does that match? Well, there's a bit of an overlap. LGB and those with a limiting long-term illness disability map onto who you think is unfairly treated. People over 70, we thought they were unfairly treated. When we asked people over 70, had you been unfairly treated? Didn't come through at all in the survey. They were not likely to say that they've been unfairly treated. Catholics, similarly, were no more likely than Protestants to say they'd experienced unfair treatment. It approximated the average of about a third. There were also interesting differences in where people had been treated unfairly. I can just give you some examples. People thought that LGB were most likely to be harassed due to membership of their group, but actually the experience was much, much wider. They said that they suffered harassment. They said that they suffered issues accessing public services, also in accessing shops and in the rental markets. Those with a disability were perceived as suffering poor access to work or public services, but actually what they said was it was mostly in the rental market and mostly in expressing, they said, expressing their culture, how they live their lives. So again, the further depth of the survey allows you to pinpoint responses and to move beyond assumptions into actually what individuals themselves feel. We then, of those who said they'd experienced unfair treatment, we then asked, have you made a complaint? And that's not necessarily a legal complaint. It could be a complaint to the body or the individual you thought had treated you unfairly. And around 1/5 of people felt that they had, or 1/5 of people made a complaint following unfair treatment. That's broadly similar to when we last asked that question, so that hasn't changed. Who was more likely to make a complaint? More likely if you were middle-aged to make a complaint. You were more likely if you were higher qualified to make a complaint. You were more likely if you had children under 18 to make a complaint, and if you lived in the West versus in the East or in Belfast. Encouragingly for the Commission, the proportion of those who would contact the Commission for advice in such a situation had gone up dramatically. At the dark blue bar there, 40% in 2008 had risen to 60% in 2011 would come to the Commission for advice or assistance. So again, I can put that on the chart for you. And what you can see is those most likely to complain are not those most likely to have experienced unfair treatment. So there's a mismatch there. So that's of interest as well, also in terms of how you target responses. I'll only mention briefly this set of questions. They sort of sit to one side of the theme of the presentation today, but I did want to make you aware that they were there. Mindful of the economic downturn, we saw this as an opportunity to ask some questions, and this is just a sample of them. We asked, had you lost your job in the last 12 months as a result of the economic downturn? And about 7% felt they had in that situation. But again, the demographics, who was more likely to? Well, rather than the average of 7%, 23% of people with a long-term limiting illness was a key equality group coming through there. We asked, had you were you affected by reduced hours? And a quarter of people said that was true. But again, it was much more likely to apply to those with a limiting long-term illness. We asked, did you have to suffer a pay cut or a pay freeze? Again, a range of categories coming through there, but in terms of the equality groupings, Catholics more likely to find it, males more likely to find it, those with children more likely to find it, and those that were married rather than single or divorced. So again, just to point you to another whole section of the survey that we'll not really touch on today. The final section that we'll talk about is awareness. We asked about your awareness of sort of rights and equality grounds, and again, there's a whole raft of questions in there. I'll just pick up on a couple of them by way of example. And we asked about the Commission. So in terms of the equality laws, do you know you are protected on certain grounds? So around half of people felt that they were protected on the ground of religion. Only a third of people felt they were protected on the ground of gender. We also asked a similar question by area, so do you know you're protected in employment and training and a range of other questions. I thought it would be of relevance to certainly some in the audience. Ourselves and the Human Rights Commissioner have been appointed as independent mechanism in Northern Ireland for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to promote and protect that convention. We wanted to get a baseline measure of who was aware of that at present, so around a fifth of people are aware of that particular UN convention at the moment, so we'll be interested to see how that changes over time. The very final section then I'll cover is awareness of the Commission itself. About a third of people were aware of the body for promoting equality, so the unprompted answer. They said correctly, the Equality Commission. That's broadly similar to when we've asked that question in 2008, and certainly much higher than when we asked it in 2005. It's also above the sort of an EU average figure. In 2010, a survey was conducted across Europe and found that on average 16% of people knew their national equality body, so that's certainly a positive. And the next most common response was one of the former bodies, and certainly a phrasing very similar to the Equality Commission that might just trip off the tongue. If we actually told people about the Commission and said, now we've explained it to you, have you heard of us? Around half had heard of us, and that's similar again to before, and again above the comparable EU average of 37%, so that's good. And about three quarters of those people knew about our work, which is again high, and it sits between the 08 and the 05 figures. We of course were interested in, do you know of us, but we're actually really interested in, do you have confidence in us to do our job? And it was, again, very positive findings, as with the last time that we asked this. Between 2/3 and 3/4 had considerable support for the Commission. So the dark blue on the pie chart there, people thought, 2/3 of people thought we treated members of the public equally, thought we were respected by all sections of the community, and 3/4 felt we were a valued source of advice. And again, that's comparable. Another key thing in this is that sometimes there's a feeling that one section of the community is more likely to support the Commission than another section of the community, but in terms of Protestants and Catholics, there was actually no difference. They all tend towards that, the figures presented there, so no difference by community background, and that was the same the last time we asked this survey as well, so that's, I think, a positive for us, but something that isn't often conveyed in the media. So I'll just come to a close with the key points, really. Positive attitudes dominate. There is considerable support for equality and diversity, but people feel there's more need to be done. There's also this issue that 30% of people feel that it's okay to hold a prejudice on some occasions. Strongest negative attitudes to travellers, trans, East European migrants and LGB, but different groups perceived as treated most unfairly. And a key thing is that for us, those who actually felt they've been treated most unfairly were a different set of people. So that, I think, creates a challenge for us as the Commission, but also for yourselves in policy roles in terms of getting the message out. But twice as many people this time around thought they had experienced unfair treatment compared to 3 years ago, so that's also a marker. And as I've just said, similar awareness of ourselves and certainly majority support. There are various links you've been provided with today in terms of getting access to this direct report. You can get access to all our research reports and the previous surveys as well on Equality NI/research. So thank you very much.